the last 3 decades, equity release has been steadily establishing itself as a mainstream later life financial planning tool, as older homeowners across the UK look to unlock the financial potential in their properties to help fund their later life plans. And that pace of growth has been accelerating exponentially over the last few years. In the 10 years from 2011 to 2020, the total amount of equity released across the UK amounted to almost £23 billion. But 75% of that, around £17 billion, was released just in the last 5 years alone. And despite the inevitable interruptions caused by COVID, consumer confidence remains strong and current lending volumes are back at pre-COVID levels. And for specialist advisors on a mission to secure a better retirement outcome for their clients, there has never been more choice and flexibility on offer. With hundreds of products and options now available and new lenders entering the market, an advisor's job is getting ever trickier as they try and navigate their way through not only product choice, but also each lender's application process and risk appetite. From the initial valuation to the underwriting process and eventually the offer, which may come with conditions attached, advisors need to work hard and learn fast against a backdrop of varied and sometimes complex application criteria in order to help step their clients through the process towards completion. The purpose of this programme is to help you better understand that process from application to completion and arm you with the knowledge necessary to help you avoid the pitfalls that can lead to applications being declined by a lender, or indeed applications being cancelled by your clients because of problems further down the track. Let's start with the valuation process, often a highly emotive and indeed subjective one, as clients may well have very firm views about how much their property is worth. According to data from leading valuation experts eServe, typically around a third of valuations for lifetime mortgages result in a figure below the estimated value placed on the property by the client and their advisor. So while the vast majority of properties end up being valued at or even slightly higher than the client's estimate, inevitably a valuation below the estimated level can have knock-on effects to the client's borrowing capability and of course the advice recommendations you have made. So how does a surveyor arrive at a valuation figure for a lifetime mortgage application? What factors influence that valuation? And how do surveyors compare different property types to arrive at the final figure? In this short presentation by valuation experts eServe, we'll look at something called the comparable method of valuation, how different qualitative and quantitative aspects affect the outcome, and how analysis metrics are used to arrive at the final figure.
Welcome, my name is James Ginley and I am Director of Technical Surveying for eServe Chartered Surveyors. During the presentation today, we will be taking a look at the valuation of residential property, with a specific look at the comparable method of valuation used by eServe surveyors when we are valuing for mortgage purposes. Let's start off with something simple. A jar of Marmite. Some people love it, some people loathe it. So, tell me, how much do you think this jar of Marmite is worth? If you sat in front of a judge, how would you justify your figure? This is the question surveyors have to ask themselves when valuing properties. We need to feel confident that our valuation will hold up under legal scrutiny of the evidence that we have selected to support it. This is why, as an industry, we are regulated and have guidance notes to aid us in maintaining a professional and consistent approach to valuation. In 2019, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors produced a guidance note outlining the principles of comparable evidence. As surveyors, we are duty-bound to adhere to guidance notes produced by the RICS and adopt these as standard practice. This guidance note discusses the use of comparable evidence in the valuation process, and it has 4 main purposes. Firstly, to outline the principles of the use of comparable evidence, to encourage consistency in the use of comparable evidence globally, to address issues of availability and use of comparable evidence, especially in challenging market conditions. And finally, to consider potential sources of comparable evidence and their relative importance. It's important to emphasise that this guidance note is not prescriptive. The content covers a broad area of practice and applies to a wide variety of market conditions and circumstances. It unfortunately does not contain a magic formula that all surveyors use to determine value, although this would be very handy. When it comes to buying or selling a house, can you think of any factors that could have an influence on the value of that property? There are numerous factors affecting the value of property, including the size, the style, the condition, location, tenure, local amenities, and many others. The onus is placed on the surveyor to undertake the appropriate levels of research and adjustment to provide a fully justified valuation. In the eyes of the law, we are accountable for the decisions we make, whether about the suitability of the property for lending purposes or indeed the value. So how would we go about selecting the appropriate comparable evidence? Now that we have taken a look at some of the key factors affecting value, it is also important to understand the process of selecting the comparables and how we determine a hierarchy of comparable evidence. The RICS guidance note mentioned previously states that ideally comparable evidence should be satisfying the following requirements. There should be a minimum of 3 comparable properties selected, although more can be used for complicated properties. For example, consider rural properties or those with land. They should be as similar as possible to the subject property in terms of size, age, condition and location, etc. The data needs to be verifiable from transaction prices confirmed by Rightmove or HMLR. Completed transactions are preferred, although exchanged subject to contract are also acceptable, and sold subject to contract within a rapidly rising market or falling market. Under offer properties can also be used to support the tone of value, but should not be solely relied upon. It's important that any evidence selected is consistent with local market practice and demand, which means that it is representative of the market on the date of valuation, although we are permitted to go back as far as 6 months. Overinflated purchase prices should be a red flag to a surveyor, as this could involve money laundering activity. They should also be the result of arm's length transactions in the market, which is a deal between 2 people acting in their own best interests. It is important to understand that asking prices on their own do not provide reliable evidence of value and should be treated with caution, because they often differ substantially from the agreed final transaction price. Once we have selected our 3 suitable comparable properties, we need to adjust their values based upon qualitative and quantitative differences to bring them in line with the subject property. It is relatively rare to find comparable evidence that exactly matches the property being valued, so adjustments are required to allow for differences in the various factors that can affect value. This leads us to the question, is valuation an art or a science? Comparable properties need to be carefully scrutinised, assessed and analysed before they can be used effectively. The quantitative process of data collection helps us to convert raw data into usable comparable evidence. The floor area, number of bedrooms a property has is an example of quantitative data. Other adjustments may require the valuer to make a more qualitative judgment based upon experience and knowledge of the local market. For example, the effects of small but significant differences in location. Think about those honeypot locations in your own areas that command a higher than average price. Why is this? School catchment areas are a good example. What other location factors do you think could have a significant impact on your adjustments? As you can hopefully see, valuation is therefore both an art and a science, which is why it is not uncommon to see a variation in valuation figures between surveyors, even those working for the same firm. Using the data available to us within the Rightmove Surveyor Comparable Tool, SCT, we are able to create comparable matrices that allow us to calculate an adjusted value for each of the selected comparable properties. This is where it can become more subjective and why valuers' opinions on a property can differ, as there is no hard and fast rule about how to make adjustments to value. Let's take a look at the Surveyor Comparable tool in a bit more detail by using the property we saw Stuart standing outside a few minutes ago as an example. When selecting our comparable properties, it's important to find properties as similar to the subject property as possible that have completed recently, ideally within the previous 6 months. However, this is not always possible due to a number of factors. There may currently be a lack of suitable housing stock nearby. Perhaps the subject property may be located within a rural area with limited completed transactions to choose from. We could be inspecting an unusual type of property, for example, a bespoke self-build. A static or slow-moving market can often be just as challenging as rapidly rising or rapidly falling markets. Lengthy delays in HMLR data or transactions being updated can create a lack of searchable comparables. When considering each comparable property selected, we use the matrices to arrive at the adjusted valuation figure. Remember though, it's the value of the comparable property that we are adjusting, not the subject property. It's also important to remember that where the subject property is considered to be better than the comparable property, i.e. bigger, higher spec or better location, then all adjustments will be made upwards. For example, the subject property has a large conservatory, but the comparable property does not. However, in all other ways, the properties are very similar. The surveyor may look to adjust their valuation of the comparable property up by either a reasonably appropriate monetary figure or a set percentage. In this instance, I've adjusted the value of the comparable property up by £15,000 to account for the conservatory. What would happen though if it were the comparable property that had the conservatory and not the subject property? In that instance, you would instead adjust the comparable property value down by £15,000. Once you have calculated the adjusted value of each of the 3 comparable properties selected, you will have created your adjusted valuation range. Say for example, a range of £250,000 to £280,000. Having carried out the necessary research and applying this methodology, the surveyor can then assess where within this range the subject property should sit. If the subject property is of a high standard within a desirable location, you would expect a valuation to be assigned towards the top end of the adjusted valuation range. Conversely, if the subject property were in a state of disrepair, you would expect a valuation towards the lower end of the range. In conclusion, the mortgage valuation is a professional opinion based upon evidence. You can help your clients by understanding this, and perhaps they need to know a little more about the property market in their area in order to have a discussion with the valuer when on site. Property is close to all of our hearts, so hopefully that has been helpful in understanding our approach to valuation and the professional opinion that goes into our reports.